Thomas Reeve wasn't supposed to be on the last train that night. The other janitor had called in sick again, and the supervisor had begged him to cover. It was nearly midnight, and the freezing December wind howled against the dirty glass of Manchester's outdated train station. Thomas, 36, hunched in his worn grey overalls, carried his cleaning kit and dragged his heavy boots through the damp steel carriage. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long ghostly shadows between rows of empty seats. As he moved into the last compartment, he paused. There was a sound, barely audible at first. Not the creak of the train or the wind whining through the metal gaps. It was high-pitched, fragile, a whimper. He froze, eyes narrowing. Then it came again, a soft, desperate cry. His heart knocked against his ribs. Slowly, cautiously, he followed the sound to the very last row. There, jammed beneath a grimy bench seat, was a navy blue duffel bag. Zipped shut. The bag shifted. Moved. Something, or someone, was inside. Thomas's hands shook as he crouched and unzipped the bag. At first, he didn't register what he was seeing. A pale, trembling newborn, wrapped in a blood-stained cotton shirt, lay squirming weakly inside. Her skin was mottled, her lips slightly blue, and her breath shallow and uneven. Thomas staggered back, heart racing. But then he saw it. Taped to the baby's chest was a torn piece of paper, soaked and crumpled. In rushed handwriting, it read, "Her name is Hope. Please don't let her die like I did." His mouth went dry. He looked around, half expecting someone to jump out, yell, confess, or take her back. But the train was empty. The world had gone still. Just him, the dark carriage, and the child someone had given up on. Thomas stared at the note. "Like I did." Did the mother die? Was she alive? How could someone abandon a newborn like this? He cradled the baby, who let out a frail, rattling sob. Instinct kicked in before logic could. He wrapped her in his flannel jacket, pressing her close to his chest. His own breath hitched. He hadn't held a baby in 13 years. Not since the accident. Not since he lost Claire and their unborn son. That memory surged like cold water, the night of the crash slicing back into him. The doctor's voice. We couldn't save the baby. His world had ended that day. He'd spent the years since drifting, a ghost sweeping carriages, polishing railings, barely speaking to anyone outside of work. Now here he was, holding life again, fragile, real, and screaming for help. He ran through the carriage, heart in his throat, shouting for anyone, security, a guard, anyone who could call emergency services. But the station was nearly deserted. Snow started to fall as he pushed through the train doors into the frigid night. A lone cab driver stood outside lighting a cigarette, startled by the sight of Thomas sprinting toward him with a baby in his arms. "She's not breathing right," Thomas shouted. "She's freezing." The cabbie stubbed the cigarette instantly and swung the door open. "Hospital. Fast as you can." Thomas slid into the back seat, shielding the baby's face with his hand, whispering nonsense like it would keep her awake. "Stay with me, baby girl. I've got you. Just hold on." Her tiny hand gripped his index finger with more strength than he thought possible. At the hospital, nurses swarmed them the moment he rushed inside. The world became a blur of white coats, medical jargon, and beeping machines. Thomas stood in the hallway, shirtless under his coat, shaking and soaked, staring at the blood-stained shirt she'd been wrapped in. A female officer eventually approached him, asking questions, taking notes. He handed her the torn note with trembling fingers. When the nurse returned hours later, she told him, "She's stable now. You brought her in just in time." Another hour, she didn't finish. Instead, she added, "She doesn't have a name in our system." Did the note really say Hope? Thomas nodded. The nurse smiled gently. "It suits her." He sat in the waiting room all night, unable to leave. He didn't know why. He wasn't her father, her uncle, or anything. But something inside him had changed the moment he heard that cry. The hospital offered to send her into emergency foster care by morning. Thomas couldn't sleep. At dawn, he stood in front of the hospital window, staring at the snow-covered street. For 13 years, he had believed the universe had taken everything from him. But now, maybe the universe was giving something back. A second chance. He turned around, marched up to the nurse's desk, and said quietly, "I want to file for custody." The nurse blinked in surprise. Are you family? He hesitated, then said with quiet certainty, I will be. Thomas hadn't slept in 30 hours. The harsh white lights of the hospital bled through his skull like static. Every time his eyes fluttered shut he saw her, the baby girl, her skin a pale slate, her tiny chest struggling under wires and tubes. She didn't cry much. That terrified him more than anything. Crying meant strength. But she lay in silence, her heartbeat fluttering on the monitor like a dying moth. He didn't even know if she'd make it through the hour. Her name, Hope, wasn't his idea, but it was perfect. The name on the crumpled paper clutched in his jacket pocket wasn't just a plea, it was prophecy. It whispered to him now, louder than the nurses, louder than the machines. Please don't let her die like I did. Thomas hadn't cried since his wife died 3 winters ago, but now his body betrayed him. Hot tears streamed silently as he sat alone in the waiting room, his boots tracking melted snow on the linoleum floor, hands trembling from fear, not cold. When the doctor, a middle-aged man with gentle brown eyes and tired hands, finally approached him, Thomas stood too fast, nearly stumbling. The man didn't have to speak. The brief flicker of uncertainty behind his eyes said enough. She's critical, he said quietly, but she's still fighting. Fighting. That word lit something deep in Thomas's chest, something long buried. He nodded, then muttered, I want to stay.
I want to do what he can.
She needs someone to sign as next of kin, the doctor said slowly. There's no one else. No ID. No parent has come forward. If she survives, she'll go to the system. Thomas didn't even hesitate.
No.
She's not going to any system. The doctor looked at him skeptically. Are you saying you're her guardian? No, Thomas said hoarsely. I'm saying I'll become one. The hospital staff weren't thrilled. Social workers were called. Papers were pushed. But Thomas didn't leave. Not even for a second. He slept in a plastic chair beside her neonatal unit, his chin on his chest, waking at every beeping sound or nurse movement. When the baby's fingers twitched against his gloved palm 3 nights later, he whispered hope, and for the first time, her eyes opened. Not fully, just a sliver, but enough.
Enough for Thomas to break into sob right there, whispering over and over, you're gonna make it. You're gonna live.
When a young social worker named Maggie came to evaluate him, clipboard, tight bun, skeptical eyes, Thomas stood his ground. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted, but I swear I'll learn.
He won't deliver.
Someone already did that. Maggie looked at him long and hard, then scribbled something.
There's bled in 2 weeks.
Thomas went from holding Hope through latex gloves to cradling her in his arms while she cried. She cried loudly now, a piercing, furious wail. Thomas would smile every time. The hospital staff softened. Nurses started bringing extra blankets, extra formula, and even an old stroller someone left in the lost and found. And on the 22nd day, when the state finally approved temporary custody, Thomas took Hope home. Home was a tiny 1-bedroom flat above the train station, its wallpaper yellowed with time and windows that didn't shut properly. But he cleaned it top to bottom. Bought a heater. Borrowed a crib from a co-worker's sister. Hope cried every night at 3:12 a.m., without fail. And Thomas, no matter how exhausted, no matter how overwhelmed, would wake, scoop her up, and whisper, you're safe. You're not alone. I got you. He worked nights, janitor shifts at the depot, taking Hope with him in a sling against his chest when he could. When he couldn't, Maggie, now more than just a social worker, would watch her for free. She'd come by with groceries, with formula, with lullabies from her own childhood. You're doing something good, she told Thomas one evening. He didn't answer, just kissed Hope's forehead and whispered, I just want her to grow up never remembering she was left. The years passed slowly, then all at once. Hope learned to walk gripping Thomas's thumb. She said D before any other word. She wore second-hand clothes and carried books to the depot to read while he worked. And one day she was 4, she looked at him with her big storm-gray eyes and asked, Did my real daddy leave me? Thomas looked at her long and steady. No, he said. He came running. That night, when he thought she was asleep, he wept harder than ever. Hope had saved him, even if she didn't know it. She pulled him from the bottom of his grief, out of a cold world, and gave him a reason to stand again. What neither of them knew, standing in that small apartment above the depot, was that in 21 years, Hope would return the favor, in a way neither could imagine. The tiny apartment above the old bookstore smelled like coffee and paper, a comforting scent that wrapped around Thomas as he rocked the baby in his arms, counting her breaths like precious seconds. Hope was 6 months old now, stronger, louder, full of life and spirit he could never explain. She had survived. Against every medical warning, she'd survived. And so had he. Thomas found himself reorganizing his entire life around her feedings, her cries, her tiny giggles at the old cuckoo clock on the kitchen wall. The man who once drifted from temp jobs and fast food wrappers now read parenting books under a dim lamp, scrawled her feeding times on the back of used envelopes, and fell asleep humming lullabies he didn't know he remembered. Money was tight. The bills piled like bricks on his nightstand. He worked nights shelving books, watching over the shop, sometimes lugging Hope in her carrier between the rows of novels while she stared wide-eyed at the world. At times, he wondered what her first memory would be, this cramped little space, his unshaven face hovering over her crib, the shadows on the ceiling that danced when wind rustled the blinds. She grew fast, her eyes wide and curious, the kind of eyes that watched everything and missed nothing. At 1.5, she'd sit in the bookstore window and wave at passing dogs. By 3, she was correcting him when he misread words during bedtime stories. Thomas never told her the full truth, just that she had been left, not lost, and that he had found her exactly when he needed to. He didn't know who her parents were, didn't know why they had written her name and nothing else, but he did know this: he would never let her feel unwanted again. On her 4th birthday, they shared a cupcake with one candle in the break room of the bookstore. She wore a glittery paper crown and made a wish she wouldn't tell. "It's a secret wish," she said, her voice small but sure, "but I wished for you too." That night, Thomas cried for the first time in years, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that she was becoming everything he wasn't allowed to be as a child: loved, safe, and enough. Still, the past lingered like a whisper behind the walls. When Hope asked why she didn't have a mom, he would smile sadly and say, "Some people are born into storms, but you were born into a second chance." And she'd nod, as if she understood storms already. At school, she excelled in reading, art, and making friends with the quiet kids no one noticed. Her teachers praised her empathy. Thomas knew that quality came from the hole in her story, the invisible place where truth should have been. Sometimes she'd stare at her reflection and whisper, "Do I look like her?" And he'd pretend not to hear. Other times, he'd find her drawing pictures of trains and babies and hands reaching out from nowhere. There were no answers, and that hurt them both in different ways. By the time she was 10, Hope knew she wasn't his biologically, but that didn't shake her belief: "You're my real dad." The other one just didn't show up. At 12, she found the old paper with her name and the message, yellowed and hidden in a locked drawer. She didn't cry. She just stared at it and said, "She wanted me to live. That's enough." Thomas felt the weight of every moment in that sentence, the way she had learned to accept pain without letting it define her. They didn't talk much about the train, or the bag, or the freezing night, but the silence between them was never hollow. It was full of trust, of mornings spent sipping cocoa and watching cartoons, of late nights helping with school projects, of scraped knees and father-daughter dances and laughter echoing in a world that once abandoned them both. Then came the scholarship, the prestigious arts academy that saw in her drawings what Thomas had always seen, a voice trying to say what words couldn't. Her portfolio included sketches of trains, alleyways, babies in baskets, and fathers with tired eyes and full hearts. One drawing showed a man's hands catching a falling child midair, beneath the word landing. It moved the admissions board to tears.
Hope was 16 now. Indépendant.
Driven. Still his. And yet Thomas had begun to cough, a dry rattle that wouldn't go away. He hid it, of course. That's what he did, protect her always. But sometimes when she wasn't looking, he'd pause at the mirror and stare at himself, older now, worn thinner than he expected to be. He feared time the way some fear shadows, quiet and creeping. He had no one else. Just her. And he didn't know how to tell her that soon, she might be the one saving him. Thomas had always planned to tell her, but never knew when. Now, with the doctors whispering numbers and time frames instead of answers, it felt like life itself was pulling the words out of him. He sat on the park bench where he had once brought Hope when she was little, where she had fed pigeons with giggles, barefoot in a sundress, unaware of the weight of the world. But now Hope was 20, and she sat next to him with a portfolio tucked under her arm, her curls pulled back into a tight bun, paint smudged on her sleeve, and a silence between them so loud it felt deafening. "I need to tell you something," he began, and for once she didn't interrupt. Her eyes, so much like the baby's from the train, focused on his hands, which trembled more these days. He told her everything: the train, the bag, the baby's cry, the note, the fear, the decision not to tell social services, the guilt, the love. He braced for anger, for betrayal, but hope just stared ahead, absorbing. "So I was abandoned," she whispered after a pause, not accusing, just connecting the dots.
No,
Thomas said softly, shaking his head, "You were found. There's a difference." Her jaw clenched slightly, but she nodded, a storm in her mind. That night, she found herself unable to sleep, flipping through sketches of the alley, the train seat, the worn leather bag she'd drawn again and again without knowing why. Somewhere inside her, she had always known she didn't come from the typical beginning. Meanwhile, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, hands in his hair, the clock ticking too loudly in the silence. The diagnosis, stage 4 lung cancer, sat on the counter like a death sentence. He hadn't smoked a day in his life, but fate doesn't need reasons. Over the next few weeks, Hope began to care for him. She insisted on coming to doctor appointments, pushed his wheelchair when walking got hard, and painted beside him in the living room with quiet devotion. And then one morning, as autumn leaves tumbled outside their window, she placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You didn't just find me, Dad.
you gave me everything."
Her voice cracked slightly, and Thomas, now gaunt, sunken-eyed, and pale, closed his eyes and let a single tear escape. He hadn't heard her call him Dad like that in years. It didn't erase the secrets, but it bridged something far deeper. A week later, she skipped class and wheeled him to the same train station where it all began. He couldn't walk anymore, but he insisted on sitting alone for just 5 minutes. She watched from behind a pillar as he looked at the tracks, his eyes clouded but present, lips moving in silent gratitude or prayer, she couldn't tell which. Then, without thinking, she pulled out her sketchpad and began to draw. Him. The station. The echo of their origin.
The scared beauty of the moment.
And in her lines, the fear, love, and unspoken forgiveness all poured out. That night, he told her, "You don't need to find your past. You already built your future." And for the first time since hearing the diagnosis, she cried, not because she was losing him, but because she realized she had finally found herself. The days that followed the hospital visit blurred into a strange, slow motion for Thomas. Every heartbeat now felt more like a countdown. The doctors didn't sugarcoat anything. His liver was failing, his body rejecting years of quiet damage, and even with treatment, time had grown terribly short. But something unexpected had shifted. Hope didn't run. She didn't retreat into silence or anger. She returned the next morning, paint smudges still on her sleeves, a steaming thermos in hand, and said softly, "We have a lot to talk about." And so, for the first time in both their lives, they did. Over chipped mugs of tea and quiet glances, they unstitched the years. Hope told him about the orphanage, the countless homes she passed through, the way she stopped using the name Lydia and chose Hope instead, because she didn't want to carry anyone's baggage but her own. She showed him her artwork, sketches of places she dreamed of, faceless people who once meant the world and then vanished, and a painting half-finished, of a baby sleeping in a red fleece blanket, swaddled in a train bag. Thomas broke when he saw it. Not just because it was beautiful, but because she had drawn it from memory. A memory no one should have had at 2 days old. "I saw you," she whispered. "You picked me up like you knew me. You didn't even hesitate." Thomas choked on tears that fell hot and helpless. "I didn't hesitate because I saw your fingers move. The smallest sign of life. And somehow, that was enough." Those quiet days turned into rituals, hospital visits, stories exchanged, silences that spoke volumes. And one afternoon, after hours spent looking over old photo albums and sharing guarded laughter, Hope said the words Thomas had never imagined hearing. "You didn't ruin my life. You started it." But just when it seemed peace had finally come, the final blow landed. Thomas's condition nosedived. He collapsed in the kitchen one morning, hands trembling too hard to grab the counter. Hope screamed his name, called 911, rode in the ambulance with blood draining from her face. For the next 48 hours, he drifted in and out of consciousness. Machines beeped, tubes ran into his veins, and the hospital room dimmed into a theater of memories. In those hazy hours, He remembered her cries on the train. The screech of brakes. The bag.
The smell of metal handle leather.
But mostly, her eyes.
Wide, dark, alive.
When he woke, everything had changed. A transplant list was out of the question. Too late, too risky. Doctors offered palliative care.
Comfort.
Weeks, they said. Maybe. And just when Thomas began to resign to silence, Hope stood beside him, shoulders squared, jaw set, a fire in her eyes that reminded him of her mother. I want to find her, she said.
My birth mother.
I need to know why she left me. Thomas wanted to stop her, shield her from whatever shadows that truth might hold, but she was already gone. Hope disappeared for a week. No calls, no messages. And just when fear began to crawl back into Thomas's heart, she returned, not with answers, but with someone, a woman in her mid-40s, tall, ghost-pale, and visibly trembling. Her name was Kira. And when Thomas looked into her eyes, he saw the storm of 25 years reflected right back. Kira had been 16, terrified, alone. She'd wrapped her newborn in the only warm thing she had, her school bag, and left her on the train, praying someone kinder would find her. That someone had been Thomas. She tried to come back, she said, tried to reclaim the baby, but was told she'd waited too long, the baby had already been adopted. She'd believed Hope had grown up in a better life. She was wrong. And now, as the three of them sat in the hospital room, silence hung between them, brittle, honest, almost holy. Then Kira said, I gave her up, and you gave her life. Can I help you now? Thomas blinked through blurring eyes. Help how? Kira turned to Hope. I want to take care of you both. He doesn't have weeks. We can't fix that. But we can give him peace. We can make these days count. Hope said nothing, only took Thomas's hand and squeezed. That night, Thomas fell asleep not with fear in his chest, but with warmth. There were no monitors beeping, no sterile lights. Just the sound of Hope sketching in the corner, Kira humming something soft, and the quiet promise of a final chapter not alone, not abandoned, but surrounded. The hospital discharged Thomas 3 weeks later, thinner but stable, and with a new routine, daily meds, low salt, a strict heart monitoring protocol, and 2 women who refused to leave his side. Hope had moved her easel into his living room, converting his faded bachelor apartment into an explosion of charcoal smudges, canvas textures, and hopeful chaos. Kira visited every afternoon like clockwork, often bringing soup she didn't know how to make properly, and awkward stories about her job managing hotel linens in Philly. They were not a perfect trio. Kira sometimes flinched at Hope's messy defiance, and Hope often rolled her eyes at Kira's overly cautious optimism, but Thomas loved the unease. It meant they were trying. And then came the coal. The gallery in Brooklyn, the one Hope had applied to months ago, had selected her painting of the baby in the bag, the one Thomas had never stopped dreaming about, for their centerpiece exhibit. It would be titled Inheritance. Thomas had tried to argue with her at first, said he didn't deserve the tribute, that she was the one who built her life from ashes, but Hope only smiled and said softly, You gave me the first breath. I gave you back your last. At the gallery opening, Thomas walked in slow, with a cane and a shaking hand, but his back was straighter than it had been in years. The room was packed with people who knew nothing about what really happened on that train in 2000. And yet they stood quietly, absorbing the painting's impossible intimacy, a newborn wrapped in red fleece, her cheeks dusted with grime and tears, staring upward like she already knew the world she was entering. Beneath the canvas, a simple plaque read, Artist, Hope T. Nothing more. No tragedy. No train. No blood or abandonment. Just the name he gave her. When the applause began, Thomas cried, and this time, he didn't hide it. Because this moment wasn't about the broken things anymore. It was about everything that survived. In the weeks that followed Thomas's story, the man who found a baby and raised her without knowing he was saving his own future, began circulating again, this time not on tabloids or late-night news, but through podcast episodes, handwritten letters from strangers, and art blogs run by college students who felt seen. Kira, now walking beside Hope like a friend more than a mother, had begun to rediscover the idea of forgiveness, even if she never fully explained why she left her child that day. Sometimes silence told the truth more gently than confession. And Hope, she was no longer the girl looking for who to blame. She was the woman who gave her father a reason to live again. Months later, on Thomas's birthday, they rode the train together. Same route, same time of day, like muscle memory pulling them toward the past. Hope leaned her head on his shoulder, sketchbook in her lap, drawing the faces of strangers around them. When the train slowed at the exact spot where she had once been left in a bag, neither of them looked out the window. They just held hands. Because the past had already given them everything they needed. And now, it belonged to the tracks behind them.